risk, what we can learn from ecosystems, non-human systems, that can help us tweak our human systems in ways that can avoid some of these worst case kind of hard knocks we face sometimes. I'm Andy Revkin. I am the founding director of an initiative on communication and sustainability at the Earth Institute of Columbia University, something I just started 7 months ago or so. Basically focused on how you make information matter in an age of what so often feels like too much information. And a lot of this relates to what communities of readers and learners have to think about in terms of how they filter information. And here you are now with COVID-19, choose your hashtag, and we faced an enormous challenge on that front. I wanted to start by reading something that Jeff Schlegelmilch, who is a colleague here, who's the incoming director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at Columbia, put together and said the other day. And it's worthwhile hearing. He said, a quick word of advice. He posted this on his Facebook page. A quick word of advice to folks out there struggling to keep up with the latest COVID-19 info. Don't try and keep up. He said there's a lot of real-time raw information coming out constantly. For instance, promising results from one isolated clinical trial, or President Trump suddenly glomming on to chloroquine. You know what we're talking about. He said this fire hose of information is not actionable. In other words, you choose a way to filter your feelings as you're looking at your feed, at your screen. So you have a capacity to think, okay, this is really not useful to me right now. And that can be a way through. He says the fire hose of information is not actionable and may even be dangerous if it becomes worth listening to. The CDC and local health officials and other officials will update their guidelines and you'll hear it in a more coherent way. Or from media who have that approach, or maybe from conversations like this. He concludes, take some time daily to review the latest information from official sources, CDC, your state, local health departments and officials, who will update you on what the science tells us. That should be more than enough to keep you updated. We are all dealing with a tremendous amount of uncertainty. Adding more noise won't add to anything but your anxiety. Use your best judgment with the information available, and for the space in between, find ways to relax, to recharge, and if you're able, to help others who may be in need. So start with your own sustainability and then build outwards. We just had the conversation this morning with him, Earth Institute staff, several hundred people, and it was a really inspiring way to think about things. So with that in mind, it is also useful for those who have the time and inclination to dive in a little deeper. And today the goal is to look at this system that we're in that allowed a virus to jump from an animal to a person somewhere in Wuhan, and then through a market to then spread incredibly rapidly from mid-November roughly to being something that's changing everything that humans take for granted, everything, and with an uncertain outcome going forward. And our guests today here on Sustain What, our Earth Institute broadcast, are, let me just get my notes right in front of me. Not that I need them. Deborah Brosnan, who is a marine scientist by training, but who's become a disaster and resilience consultant and analyst through 20 years of hard work that started with a volcanic eruption. She might be able to tell you a little bit about that. Deborah Brosnan. And we have Patrick Keyes at Colorado State University, who is a lead author on a recent paper, geographer, who caught my attention powerfully with a paper that came out last year on what he calls Anthropocene Risk, with a group, many of the other co-authors, mostly in Stockholm. On the links that were around the video, you can find these papers. And Saleem Ali, who I've known for a long time, has been on a journey through academia. He's a environment and energy professor at the University of Delaware with a really cool endowed name. What is your title again?
It's the university color, the blue and gold distinguished professor.
Ah, blue and gold distinguished professor. I like that. Yeah. So, and we're going to talk about a few things. Let me just change the screen layout so that you can see who we are a little better. And people visiting on all these different platforms can post comments and questions. So start that flowing when you can. Let's start with Deborah, and tell us where you are, by the way, physically. I want each of you to give us a little checkup on how you are and where you are.
Yeah, I'm physically right now, I'm in the Caribbean. I'm on the island of Antigua, which is obviously a very beautiful island, tropical. Um, Practicing social distancing, staying connected to friends through basically every form of technology that I can, phone, Facebook, video chats. So feeling distant and feeling connected at the same time.
And what's the vibe in on the island?
People are concerned in the island. Obviously, living on an island, it's a smaller community. People are much more in touch with each other. Uh, there is a concern of how will this evolve. Many of the flights have shut down. So there is a health concern, there's an economic concern, and there's a social concern, certainly.
And has there been much testing there yet, or do they have an indication of how prevalent it is?
Yes, they do. I believe as of now they have, I think, 3 cases confirmed. They are testing. They're testing people coming into the island. They've been working very quickly to set up medical facilities, quarantine facilities, extra hospitals. And I understand that a group of doctors came in from Cuba, doctors and nurses, just recently to help out should it be needed.
That's interesting.
So I think Antigua is learning from what's happened elsewhere in the world and trying to take care of its people and also balance, as we all are with this, how do we do it and how do we still have a normal life?
Right. So maybe we'll do a quick round robin on just the general vibe where you are, and then go back to Deborah to talk a little bit about your work. Patrick, so you're in Fort Collins. And what's your situation at the moment? And then we can get into the details of the work.
Yeah, so I'm in Fort Collins right now. My family has been in sort of voluntary self-quarantine lockdown. We've got 2 little boys, and so we're trying to keep them home from daycare. And also myself and my partner are both work at the university, so we're mandated to work from home from about a week ago at least. And so the vibe here, though, I would say it's, aside from grocery stores perhaps unnecessarily being vacant, there is, I think in general, people sort of get it here. They understand that the importance of social distancing, and a lot, at least at the university, which employs a lot of people here in Fort Collins, people are taking it pretty seriously. I will say there's far too many people on the trail, which is not very wide, that runs through town. But aside from that, it's been sort of a very unexpected adventure so far. And
yeah. It's so weird because, it's unexpected yet long predicted and actually inevitable that something like this would have happened given the systems we have so far. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And Saleem, are you in Delaware, or where are you?
Yes, I'm at home in Delaware, and here also, just like Fort Collins, we have a mandatory stay at home from the university until May 4th, actually. So all the classes are going online. There is also, a lot of media attention here in the state because Vice President Biden is now running his campaign out of his house 15 minutes away from my house. So it's interesting.
Is it? I have to ask. I haven't had time to look. Is it true that he had a podium set up in his room or something? So he was
actually that's right. Yeah, he's made his living room a studio, and he also has affiliation with the university. So we have the Joseph R. Biden School of Public Policy. So it's an interesting time in an election year to be in Delaware.
Fascinating. So, in the general sense you have, is Delaware? Do you have the equivalent of Governor Cuomo, who's been, nonstop offering kind of a rational space for keeping track?
We're a small state, but we're nested between some giant metropolitan states. So, we're midway between Washington and New York on the train route. So that does make us vulnerable at one level, but we also have the opportunity to be a governance experiment because we're a small state, about 1 million people. We can learn from our neighbors, but we can do some, innovative things like we've done with our tax law as well.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So let's swing back to Deborah. I think I first focused on your work. Maybe it was earlier, but you had been involved with this European Science Foundation report. It had a title. It was like it wasn't like a manifesto, but it was definitely a position paper on big risk.
Yes, yeah.
And it was geohazards in that case, asteroids and big earthquake, tsunami. But obviously the same dimensions, if not even more serious dimensions, lie around the virus threat that we've now seen. And I was just hoping you could kind of explore where we're at right now in the context of that learning and what the world lacks or could have to create a better kind of we're never going to get these things right, but to get them less wrong.
Yeah. So thanks, Andy. And first of all, thanks for having me. But second, happy birthday.
Thank you.
I believe it's your birthday today.
Yeah, when I'm 64. This is not exactly what I kind of figured I'd be doing on my birthday, but here we are. Thank you.
Yeah. So anyway, so thanks for the question. So what I'd like to do is let me step back a little, because I think this will be helpful to you and to perhaps people listening in, kind of how I came from my background, as you said, with marine science, evolutionary ecology, marine science, to working in risk and resilience, because I think the transition is very relevant to what we're dealing with today. So for me, this was not planned. It literally landed in my lap, much like we hadn't planned on being where we are today. I had flown out to the island of Montserrat in the Caribbean with the idea of looking at coral reefs and looking at their natural resources, the idea being to set up a marine reserve and park. And literally, as we were flying in, a volcano started erupting. And we were flying in looking at these plumes of ash and plumes of steam coming out of the side of the mountain. And I didn't know it then, but that was the transformative day in my life. When we got onto the island, everybody was aware that this volcano was erupting, but none of us really knew how to interpret it. None of us really thought how serious it might be. But gradually, we were quite complacent, but gradually it started to get worse. And I remember having a coffee with a very senior official and saying to him at one point, I think we should start getting our scientific. And his comment to me was, well, I'm more concerned about the effect we might have on the economy. What will it do for tourism? And what will it do to people if we start putting this information out and they can't understand it and it frightens them? And I said, I think people have noticed that there's a volcano happening. And he literally said to me, do you think that's true? And I said, yes, because right behind him, and the way I'm looking at you, literally right behind him, out the window, about a mile away, was a steam vent pushing out steam and ash, literally into the sky. And I said, yes, I think everybody's noticed. But we didn't move forward. It took a while for the information to come out. It took a long discussion of what should happen, what shouldn't happen. And that really transformed me to thinking I need to pay attention to risk and resilience more than I do. So it changed my career. But what I see too here is a real similarity between what happened in Montserrat and what we see happening with the virus. Everybody knew the virus was there. We knew there was a risk from the virus. We started seeing the information coming out. People weren't sure how bad would it be. Well, maybe we don't go to work, but is it okay if we're young and we go to the bar? And those kind of developments have been happening with consequences for us. And perhaps the most important lesson is that we need to be looking seriously at the consequences of these rare events and taking action very quickly to solve them. And we can.
That initial conversation you had with the official is so telling, because it reverberates exactly with some things that have been said in recent days about this. The kids on the beach, or it's like Jaws back in 1977, the movie Jaws, where the local town council is saying, well, do we really have to clear the beach? And so what is there like a first step now that you found that doesn't take the volcano? Have you seen an instance where the volcano had not yet erupted, but where people have acted proactively?
I think it's rare, but I think we've learned lessons from there that we are implementing. And there's three things that from my experience, we can do in those situations. The first is to communicate accurately, communicate the science, and communicate often. That is the number one thing. The second is to let people know what it is that they can personally do, whether it is in this case to social distance, whether it is to evacuate, whether it is to have a bag ready to leave. Let everybody know what they can do. And we talked about climate change, and I want to contrast this a little bit to the climate change situation, where we're all often asked, well, what can I do? I'm one person. And we're looking at solutions that are global reductions in emissions. In this case, in this particular case and others, every single person makes a difference. So we can say to you, stay home, don't go out, practice good hygiene. So in this case, yes, giving people a very clear set of instructions, a very clear empowerment to take action that makes a difference. And the third thing that makes a difference, and this is more with government, is to let people know that you are getting the data, you are listening to people, and you have a plan. Not a false plan, not an out of this realm plan, but simply a plan that we're getting the data, we're looking at it, we do have a plan, we're monitoring daily, and we are adapting. And it is that concept of an adaptive plan to work with it and to let people know that we're working on it, the leaders, whoever, and that we will communicate it. And those three things really help to stem the tide. Communication of science, clear articulation of what you do, and an adaptive plan.
I'm going to head to Saleem next. That notion of conveying that you have an adaptive plan has a kind of communication risk, I think, in the context of how elected officials think, which is that you have to convey that you don't know everything. Adaptive capacity is explicitly about uncertainty. So let's circle back to that with you, Deborah. But Saleem, so you've been studying ecosystem function and supply chains as well. You have a very wide view of this landscape. You recently, just last week, or was it this week? I can't keep track. You had this commentary that I should have had queued up here in my reading list. How the current coronavirus pandemic links to questions of ecological sustainability in the Anthropocene, something I know quite a bit about, I was on the Anthropocene working group for 6 years. Mm-hmm. So what's on your mind these days as you look at the fraying and disconnected human systems in the context of the ecological environmental work you've also done?
Yes, so thank you so much, Andy. In terms of adaptive planning, it may seem at one level like a contradictory statement, but the way in which planners have approached contemporary kinds of crises is you always want to have some kind of a structured process in place. And in this case, for pandemics, the United Nations said there were only 6 countries which actually had that. It just so happens that 2 of my countries of citizenship are among those 6, the United States and Pakistan. And it's interesting for me to compare because I'm constantly in touch with my family who are in Pakistan and how they are trying to handle it. They did have a plan, but they have a much more anarchic kind of communication structure, far more conspiracy theories and so on as a result, less of a fundamental sort of higher education base, but at the same time, very strong social institutions. So for example, religious institutions are very strong there, and getting the word out, if you can convince the mosque clerics to get the word out, you can really have a much more grassroots kind of mobilization for this kind of a crisis, even when the structural plan may itself not be sufficient. So that's what's been really quite informative for me, is trying to compare the two. In terms of also the approach which we can take from understanding borders. Some of my research is around understanding borders and how we can try and consider supply chains across borders. So, generally we think about political borders in terms of countries and nation states and so on, and they have certain export-import regulations. And that's what has been also challenged by this particular pandemic, is that we have these cross currents. On the one hand, we're trying to be more global, we're trying to dissolve borders. We've had this tension with Brexit in the last year. and as well. So, you've got those counter currents of globalization, but at the same time, strengthening of borders. And that's where I think the best kind of political lessons will need to be drawn is what kind of functional borders should we as scientists be advocating? And where do we, there's a part of us which wants to have a completely ecological approach to borders. But when we think about these kinds of pandemics, it raises questions about whether political borders, when they are well governed, can actually contain epidemics and prevent them from becoming pandemics, as was the case with Ebola. I mean, imagine if we often lament the fact that Africa has so many borders, but imagine if we did not have those borders in that particular context, containing the epidemic in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea. If it had spread to Nigeria, it would have been quite catastrophic. So finding a way to reconcile the ecological porosity of borders, which we would want, with this need to have some containment potential.
That's so interesting. And again, that's kind of a biological model. It's like cell membranes. And Europe, of course, has the same issue. Just yesterday, we had a chat here about some of these similar questions. And Jan Kwakkel, who's a risk and decision science analyst, was talking in Europe about another problem where you get what he called it's different than herd immunity. Everyone has heard about herd immunity these days, where, if you have enough people immune in a population, you lower risk. But he was talking about herd behavior in countries where there are countries in Northern Europe that were already changing their closing schools are not based on what other countries were doing, not based on empirical work, but based on perception of, oh, this is what everyone's doing, therefore do it. So those the borders are not even just physical, ecological, they're informational. Patrick, speaking of information, the thing about your paper last year on Anthropocene Risk that caught my attention was this notion of the importance of recognizing the historical underbelly of things that we see in real time that we sometimes misinterpret, whether it's water policy in the Middle East as another driver of water stress and urbanization along with climate change, or you sort of you can pick your question, terrorism, everything. And I think it's a habit that too often I see missing in the media, where the media are the ultimate purveyor of what's happening right now. And we at Columbia, one of the reasons I created this program is to foster media practices and general literacy around how do you be sure you're not missing bigger contexts to things that are going on right now. So looking at what's going on right now, I mean, you're not an epidemiologist and you're not a public health scientist, but you understand human landscapes and change. What comes to mind as like a glaring, oh man, here's another example of this, or not?
I think the first thing that jumps out, especially based on what Deborah and Saleem have said so far, stems from this idea of complexity and the ability or inability of communities to recognize complexity and what that means for an event, a chain of events, a crisis, a situation, whatever word you want to use for that. I think that piece, I think you linked to the recent Atlantic piece, which talks about the failure of systems thinking or asystemic thinking is a big reason why we were led to this current situation that we're observing now. And I think that's quite true in many ways. I do think that at the same time, this sort of thing is going to happen regardless of for complex systems thinkers or our policies are equipped to think about complexity, given our current world. We're living in a dramatically changed world. We keep comparing this to the 1918 pandemic. It is the same Earth. We have the same atoms swimming about. But aside from that, there's so much that is just radically, unrecognizably different. Our communication channels are radically different. The fact that I could get from here to Wuhan, well, not now, but easily, and almost trivially so, is just night and day compared to what it was then. And then we think about, Saleem or Andy, you brought up supply chains and all of this stuff. It radically has transformed the way our interconnected network of our world exists. And the reason that matters is because that can accelerate all of these different connections, and where there are feedbacks in a systems perspective, where there are feedbacks in a heavily connected system, that's when you can get this massive exponential changes on timescales that we are really not familiar with. I mean, we went from, at least in the United States, or I can even just take my university, we went from not really talking about this almost at all to delaying spring break by 2 days, switching to online classes, and then switching to online classes permanently for the rest of the semester at least, in less than 2 weeks. That all happened in less than 2 weeks. And so that's just a micro example, but I just think that that's something where we should have seen this coming much sooner, or at least at a systems level. Many people saw this coming much sooner. I shouldn't say we, but the circumstances that would allow for us to sense, to have a perception that something needs to be done, or we need to proact, not react.
Yeah.
Those sorts of things were not in place. I think they might be in the future now. I don't think that's a given, though. Well, I'm not sure if I stayed on target at all there, Andy. But.
No. But that last point you made is the big one that maybe we can talk about next.
Can I just respond a little? Because I think your point is spot on. And I think what we're talking about at one level is the difference between risk and consequence. So when I'm with a group of people and we're talking about, you brought up the paper we did, the position paper of the European Science Group, and we talked about the risks of a volcano on the scale of the Tambora volcano, which was 74,000 years ago, and wiped out half the people on Earth. The risks of having another one of those in a 50,000 year time frame is low. The consequence of having one now with 8 billion people is phenomenal. So the frequency of occurrence in this case was not changing, but the concept of what's going to happen, I think, is huge. And when we talk as scientists, we often talk about risks and likelihoods, but we don't often talk about, and if this happens, here's what's likely to happen, here's the outcome. And I think our decision makers and policy makers don't encourage us to anyway, because often that news is not good, and it requires them to make decisions that may not be popular. And so it's better to say, well, if it doesn't happen, it's fine. If it does happen, wow. And for politicians who want to get reelected, to shut down schools, to shut down trade and commerce, it's a big risk. But we're asking them to do it, and they're certainly doing it now, which is very good. Right. But I think this concept of consequence is really important.
Yes. No. Just a quick word, if I may say so. I think. All these points are well taken, but we do have to differentiate between this kind of risk posed by a virus exposure to geohazards like earthquakes, because clearly with geohazards, and I see a lot of lesson drawing on communication, but the primary cause is not preventable by humans, whereas here the primary cause is preventable. And that it goes back to, I would alert the audience to go to Pat's paper, where you have the Venn diagram, and there you see that the exposure part of this and the feedback loop going back, that's what has been very much consequential in terms of how we can plan for future kinds of the exposure prevention.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, and that exactly where, in essence, we're almost looking at an ecosystem where we've got the linkages. And if we can figure out which are the key ones and target those, I think that's a very good point.
I couldn't quite hear, you said we almost have the ecosystem where X, and I couldn't quite hear what that word was.
It was similar to an ecosystem model where we have linkages in the ecosystem. And I think what I understood from Saleem saying is that we can actually predict and see the pathway and have a better idea of where to intervene and when to intervene. And I think that's spot on.
Mm-hmm. So it's too soon, obviously, to sort of chart the new ecosystem, or where in this ecosystem you could create levers or knobs or control valves or alarm bells that would be different than what's there now. But do you have an initial sense of, at those borders, particularly Saleem, or what might help? I'll just give you an example of, China. There were some early stage things that happened in China in terms of suppressing information that were really troubling. And obviously the systemic global aspect of this is the fault of 1,000 people at different levels. But so where are the buttons here that can even be nudged?
Well, I mean, I think in terms of particularly zoonotic diseases, which what we're talking about here, there were many points where, we could have had a much more deliberate intervention. And this is true because we have had the experience with especially avian flu within the last decade or so. So for me, that I find to be most disturbing is that we knew that the exposure pathway was so clear, and yet there was not an effort made by multiple locales. Of course, in China, there is immediate responsibility with the wet market in Wuhan. But overall, in terms of human-wildlife interactions, we have lots of policy interventions which we could do. That's not to say we completely set aside that kind of prospect, but we have not really had a systems approach to looking at zoonotic diseases in the way we should. And these are very particular diseases. That's not to say all diseases which are infectious can be managed the same way. We have diseases which are spread through abiotic mechanisms like tetanus, and in that case, you have to think about other means.
Interesting. Sorry.
There was a very interesting program that I learned about. I was I'm on the board of the CDOC Society, the Wildlife Health Center at UC Davis. And when I spent time down at UC Davis, I learned about a program that they were running out of the Wildlife Health Center that was the lead. UC Davis was the lead institute. It was a global, multidisciplinary, multi-group effort. And the idea was to go to these areas where there was a risk for zoonotic diseases to emerge because wildlife and humans were being pushed closer together. I think that's one of the challenges that we're seeing as we use more resources in the world, as we destroy more habitats. Humans and wildlife are pushed together more often and in more risky situations. And this program went around to, it was in China, I believe, it was in Asia, India, and I think they had about 5,000 people that they had trained specifically to look out for these diseases and to do an early warning system, and they were sequencing the viruses. And they had, I believe this was one of the groups that was involved in finding one of the the Ebola viruses. That to me was a phenomenal way of gathering information, getting data on these viruses. When did these viruses make the jump? Of those jumps that are made, because it's rarely just once, which ones take hold and why, and when should we be intervening and how? Sadly, this is the story of what's been happening in the US recently. That program was shut down earlier this year. But maybe after this, it will reemerge because to Saleem's point, exactly, we have the knowledge, we have the scientists who can figure it out, who can pinpoint it. What we need is the will and the ability to step in and say, we take action here now, we're seeing this risk, let's stop it.
There's a cost estimate. Sorry, I was just going to mention a cost estimate to what Deborah said. There was a paper in 2013 in Nature by the EcoHealth Alliance group in New York. They estimated that if we wanted to map out all of the mammalian viruses, which are most likely to have some kind of zoonotic transfer, in 2013, it would have cost about $6.5 billion. Now that seems large, but it's trivial compared to the $2 trillion bailout package. And if you just did even the 85% of that amount, so you took out some which were unlikely to be transferred, it would be only $1.4 billion. So imagine the cost which we could, invest in a sensible way, and what we have not done so far.
I'm just looking for that link here. I've got it. Okay, I'll post it on Twitter.
Sure.
Yeah, that feels like, again, a very doable part of the $2 trillion that are going to be spent just in the United States. Stimulus, you're reminding me of way back a decade ago, more, 2008, when Obama was planning the stimulus package coming out of the recession. There was a lot of green jobs in there, for example. But I wrote a piece on my .earth blog saying, does the green jobs include chemists and engineers? Meaning people who can come up with the great new innovations in battery science and the like that we'll need to, along with people installing rooftop solar panels. And it never really got there. The basic R&D money increased briefly and then went away. And here again, you're talking about something with great value, that's basic science, that's applicable, that satisfies what many scientists are looking for now, which is not just tenure, but some impact in the world around them. But how do we make sure that's in the stimulus package right now, when the big debate is just about how much of it is for, green infrastructure versus stimulating business versus X? I guess that means that this conversation we're having should include a wider circle that intersects with Congress. I don't know. So Patrick, I wanted to get back to you on your paper. And I will post on Twitter. I posted links to these. I can add them. Actually, they're on the Facebook page. There were a couple of questions that came up about where to find the papers. So how do you actualize that process? Is there something that you think needs to be taught? Is it a difference in how we teach or train, whether it's journalists or political science students, or are there tools that can identify those background forcings that drive risk that can be applicable directly for policymakers? Who's read your paper, I guess, is my question.
Apparently you, so that's good.
Yeah.
And I have to laugh because I think my 1.5-year-old might come screaming in here in a second. And
okay.
so
I can bring in my dog.
I'm just saying that he might. I can see him peeking in the door.
You're managing risk, is what you're telling us.
Yeah, well, just managing expectations. It's definitely going to happen. It's just when.
Right.
But that's sort of like an outbreak, right? I mean, so this pandemic, this is something where I think it's inappropriate in some ways to say we were overdue. Our world is radically different and it's changing all the time. So to think about it in terms of are we overdue or not, I don't know if that's even the right framing. But we haven't experienced a global. Here he is. We haven't experienced a global pandemic in a long time, and so I think in many ways this is the first time we've sort of tested our global systems, our global institutions, our capacity as a really truly interconnected planet, and we're also realizing that we're not truly interconnected. Some places can handle this in ways that are very effective in terms of addressing the initial outbreak. But other places that you think ought to be able to do that can't. And so I think this has been revealing in many ways that we are very interconnected and we're vulnerable as a result of that to certain things. But then our capacity, our response capacity, indeed our response diversity is different. And we're seeing that the benefits of that in many ways. Some countries are able to apply the suppression strategy very effectively, whereas other countries are not. And that's for a whole basket of different reasons.
Right.
Governance, how democratic are those institutions, how rich are they, all of those things. And then at a smaller level, like, look at this, I'm holding something right now that allows me, and I'm able to work from home to watch my child and do this, which is part of my job.
Right.
So even within, like, say, Fort Collins or Colorado or the United States, we can think about the internal capacity and the internal diversity and capacity among the population, and then how that feeds into the vulnerability or the capacity of the nation as a whole. Here in the United States, we have a weak system of safeguards for people during a situation like this, in the sense of paid sick leave, in the sense of other supports that could be in place, more socialized medicine, that sort of thing. Those sorts of things would be very useful right now, and for us to have experience with how those work. And so some places that have those systems in place and that had an aggressive early response are doing quite well. And other places are not. Yeah, you can wave. That's fine. You can say hello. Say hello.
Hi.
Hi. Okay, perfect.
Hi.
But I think that we're seeing this play out in real time, which is terrible and it's a tragedy. But we're also seeing sort of the diversity of our kind of global political, economic, social governance ecosystem and how we respond to this. One thing I did want to return to was that I think that it's a really useful example right now to understand how complex systems work, blah, blah, blah. But also I wanted to emphasize that this event right now is not happening in a vacuum, divorced from all other events that have happened in history and will happen after us. Right. It matters, at least in the United States, it matters tremendously that we have the president that we do now versus perhaps a different president, or if it had happened maybe 4 years ago with a different president. It matters a lot in that sense. And so I think one thing that's important for understanding these sorts of events is that they are not created equal, and were they to happen in different contexts, they would be dramatically different. That really matters. There was this fantastic little report that came out, I'm not sure when, it must have been recently, from Leah Zaidi from Multiverse Design, that did a really nice job of digesting what's happening currently with the pandemic, and then figuring out and thinking about, okay, well, where might we go from here? And it really, to chart that, to understand that landscape, we really have to situate this event in the broader landscape of where we are, widening wealth inequality, all sorts of other factors that make this matter in a unique, specific way. And it could make it matter in a very impactful way, given all of these other factors. But in order to recognize what's happening, we have to understand those background contexts as well. Also to chart effective and meaningful policy responses.
Yeah,
right.
By the way, that that gets at one of the most amazing parallel issues here, which is the information system that we're all connecting through. Yeah, is the most profoundly impactful change in the Earth system that I know of in recent.
Completely.
You know, it's created this global mind that Teilhard and Vernadsky in the 1930s were toying with the idea of a planet of the mind, noosphere, and now it's kind of here. They saw it as a benevolent force, but you know, obviously it can cut both ways. So that's why, why I created my program after 30 years of me writing stories, telling you what to think. I'm working at a more fundamental level on how do we work with this information ecosystem that is just as complex and fluid, in an amazing state of plasticity because of the social elements around it that could be a force for great, amazing change right now. I've seen all these little microcosmic examples. The chairman of the Columbia Sociology Department, Seamus Khan, last week created a course, like in a matter of 2 days, and posted a course where he's teaching now online, teaches high school students how to be sociologists. So it's like how to confront this moment, how you can be an ethnographer. And I thought, wow, I mean, it's so great on so many ways because he and other teachers created and they've created a, it's called youthremote-learning.com. They created a portal for trading courses. They created he's created the course in a matter of microseconds. And that's the upside. And then there's a certain president who's, saying we're going to open the doors by Easter and using this. He's exploiting the worst aspects of the system, knowing that we have status quo bias, knowing that we all want things to go back to the way they were. And he's the ultimate carnival barker saying, come on in, we're going to open for Christmas Easter. And those two sides of the system are happening in real time, as we're saying with these border ecologies and data that make this really, let's put it this way, an amazing moment. Yeah. So Deborah, with that in mind too, I do want to see how we can amplify or.
But maybe may I just say one quick point on the president, if I could say, of course, there's much to lament about what he has done, but at the same time, the issue with the China travel ban initially, that one could argue that was, even though it was not intentioned to be a sensible decision, but it actually was. And this is what brings us in these, conundrums that you can make decisions without the right intention which could actually have a positive impact, and then they can be politically manipulated in other ways. But I think what comes out of one of the key lessons which will come out of this is how we handle border politics, which
For sure.
some things they may do which are correct as well, and we have to give credit there.
Yeah, and I think, well, let's hope that the system that emerges is better at that.
Yep.
Let me see. There was some pretty interesting questions here. Here's Mary MJ O'Connor. Wild animal trade is multinational ecosystems, local and regional. I think that's shorthand, but I think we understand. You've got pipelines for African and Asian wildlife going into China, coming out through markets, all kinds of ramifications there, supply chains and markets. I remember several years ago when the vaquita, the poor vaquita, the little porpoise that's going extinct in the Gulf of Mexico, Baja, there was speculation in Hong Kong. It was like these speculative markets and fish bladders that were driving that pulse of purchase of the totoaba fish that was endangering taking the vaquita out. So an endangered fishery was taking out an endangered marine mammal, and yikes! And I guess China has said they're shutting down wet markets. I wonder if that's really going to be a durable decision or not.
And anthropologists are quite upset about it because they feel that the wet markets themselves have a certain cultural connectivity that is important for some of the rural areas connecting with the urban parts of China and all. So that goes into the conversations then about what kind of preventative measures can you take? Can you have win-win outcomes where you do have some of this kind of cultural activity which is not still exposing people to zoonotic elements? So I think those are going to be, we'll have to first go ahead and see where are the win-wins possible, where we can have mitigation without increasing risk, and where is it not possible, and we have to actually come up with some more definitive regulations on this.
Yeah it's and then you were talking about cultural context and the like too. This relates to the inevitable variability in how the world's going to respond. I was so struck a week ago on this program. I interviewed an Indian microbiologist and a journalist there about the situation in India a week ago. And we were speculating on how do you do social distancing in India? 1.3 billion people with all of these interconnections and, urban settlements. And now Modi yesterday announced, I think it was just yesterday, maybe it was 2 days ago, that a lockdown for India, 1.3 billion people. And it just feels I feel so worried about India just generally because of all that mobility, density, and the testing level there. It was like 5 per 1 million population. Here, I think it was 20 per million population. In Korea, it was 4,000 or so tests per million population. And so what do you do? I don't know. We think we have it bad right now. If the disease is as virulent and infectious there as it is here, it feels like a really tough situation. I don't know how to...
On the other hand, I think it comes back to this desire that we have and the governments have, which is to do something, to take action with the information we have. And sometimes that action can turn out really well, and other times it can have unintended consequences. So exactly what you're saying, Andy, if you look at India as a whole, we look at how in a highly dense situation, a highly dense population where people are mobile, even within the larger neighborhoods, how will that work to stem the virus? And yet perhaps there are other parts of India where that may work very well. We really don't know how that experiment is going to work. And yet I don't know that any of us here in that position could offer a better solution.
I know. Well, this I'm going to circle back to something that was brought up by one of you earlier, which is, and it relates to the stimulus package, both the U.S. one and the international effort, which I think OECD said has to be many times the Marshall Plan. we have this habit that I've stumbled into in looking at adaptation, climate adaptation policy and finance, of spending money on things with outcomes, like build a bridge, especially build a seawall. We don't tend to prioritize, as we were saying earlier, spending money on the basic science that might create a better risk landscape, or on the skills of chemists and engineers needed to do the battery design for the next generation of batteries. And there's all these cases I've looked at where what you really want in a situation like this, especially with multiple risks, hurricane season is coming, wildfire season is coming, and this, what you want, it's not hard to identify the capacities you would want in a community that give more agility, more adaptability, more robust, resilient capacity. But how do you invest in that? Like, how do you write a check and say, okay, job done, as opposed to building a seawall? So that's another one of these biases we have in our, you must have dealt with this.
Yeah.
I think there's a way. So I was kind of asking myself a little bit of the same question just recently, not necessarily to do with the virus, but how do we look at a community that may have a particular strength but be in need of different knowledge bases, different inputs that I cannot tie to a particular, if you want to call it, return on investment. And the way we make decisions right now, and that is at the, let's say, even the multinational banks, the World Bank, Caribbean Development Bank, the metric is GDP. The metric is return on investment. What will I get back at a certain level? And it's completely financial. The way we lend money is based on the debt ratio of a country. It is all based on finance and money. And I was having lunch with an Irish woman who is one of the VPs of IMF, and we were discussing the fact that we really needed to start bringing in new metrics to these lending systems and these ways of accounting. And that could be, for instance, this concept of well-being, which is now gaining traction, particularly in the Nordic countries. Can we develop a metric for well-being? Can we look at a country and not just at its GDP and say what other skills, what other investments are necessary to raise the equivalent of reducing the debt, raise the well-being, so that we have countries that are more resilient, that have exactly what you're saying, Andy. And I think if ever that message has come home to us, it's the last 2 weeks. I mean, look at what's happened in Wall Street. Everything's been about investment, the stock market, return on investment, and it's wiped out. And what we have instead is people talking about, how are you feeling? Well-being, staying connected. Are you healthy? Are we eating healthy? All of a sudden, these discussions are coming to play more to the fore. And if we start to make these part of policy and have metrics for decision making, then I think we're on a much better track. And this is our opportunity.
I couldn't agree more. I'm just posting a piece I did in 2005 about gross national happiness. Although what it was a story really about this wider effort to assess new ways to measure progress as a way to tweak how we pursue it. And it still feels like a rough go, but this gets back to Patrick's focus on path dependency. When I did this piece, somewhere in here, there was an official from the census or the Commerce Department in the United States where they were saying Congress didn't want to grant the money to come up with a bigger basket of well-being indexes because it would reveal how badly just GDP does, at least in the context of healthcare access, education, et cetera. And it was really, I hope we were doing better now than we were then. I know France, Joe Stiglitz at Columbia had worked with the French president at that time to pursue new models.
Well, I'm disheartened to hear that this friend of mine in IMF, Anne-Marie, was saying that she's trying to get that into the system and that there is some interest there in bringing this in. Because it's exactly as you said, when that GDP fails us, what we see really is what's rotten, what isn't working. And we can make it work.
So we have really just a few more minutes here, and it feels hard to believe because it feels like we're just getting going. And by the way, that means we can always do chapter 2. Everyone, I've already had one repeat offender. Rod Schoonover, former National Intelligence Council analyst, has been on. He jumped in yesterday on our one on systems risk. So let's just go around briefly with your sense of where do we go from here? And I'd like to frame things around a question that a good friend of mine, Jeremy Zillar, who was on the very first one of these a week ago Sunday, he poses a question. That is, what in each of your worlds, in each of your ways of working and your interactions with the communities, professional or personal, could you in the next, let's say the next week, if we met next week, what thing could you do, what practice could you shift a little bit, what that could get a little tweak in the needle here, something that takes things toward a better outcome? Is there a person you haven't talked to yet? Is there a collaboration you haven't tried? How much of what we're talking about is adequately being discussed in sub-Saharan Africa? I asked that yesterday of the Rand Corporation folks I was talking to, and there was kind of some silence, and there's a good network I have of journalists in sub-Saharan Africa focused on risk reduction. And what can we, so what would be one thing? You could just go around a little bit quickly and think about that and what comes to mind.
I think, again, just off the top of my head and based on experience, I think for me, we've been talking about resilience, and I think of resilience as the process of change, not that we are resilient or that we're capable of more than we know. Resilience itself is change. It's that process we go through. And for me, it is every morning personally asking, what changes do I make? What changes can I help my community make? What things do I institute differently with my team? That we all get on the phone and check in on each other in the morning. Something as simple as that to more large-scale systematic changes. And for me, I feel that because resilience is the process of change, there is a point at the end where we have more stability. And I wake up every morning with that in mind, that we will come out of this together to some level. And resilience is the change, we will go through it to get there. And I think of that, of practicing change every morning and seeing where I can help others practice change or be part of that change. That for me is it.
Wow. I really like that. I tend to think of it as a characteristic, but you're totally right. Saleem, what's on your mind?
Yes, no, I think I totally concur with that, invocation to try and get more resilient. One way I would operationalize that in my own work, a lot of my research is on the extractive industries and minerals particularly. And one of the lessons from this is, around our mineral supply chains, what can we be thinking about? Imagine if, for example, we had an epidemic of this kind in an area where we have a very high dependence on a particular kind of commodity, and what could be the implications therein. So one of the things I'm actively working on in some of my other roles, I'm on the UN International Resource Panel, and one thing we're taking on board right away is to think about those kinds of global governance mechanisms whereby we can build that resilience, where those kinds of supply chains, whether it's for face masks or for commodities, have a much greater coordination. So I think we need to figure that out right away.
Fascinating. And Patrick, a last thought?
I think those are both fantastic. And to build off of those just a little bit, I guess if I were to take that 1 week challenge, what am I going to do maybe right now or in this week? It would probably be to work on, because I'm an instructor right now, it's one of the hats I'm wearing, is to focus on teaching my students and myself how to prepare for what's next, and to build on the resilience theme. Another characteristic of a resilient system or a resilient person, etc., is the capacity for transformation. And I think that what we should all be ready for is a transformed world on the other side of this tunnel. We don't know what that's going to look like, but we need to be prepared for that transformation. And so equipping ourselves with the whether that's a set of tools for thinking about the future, whether that is preparing yourself spiritually, mentally, physically, for whatever that kind of transformation might be, I think is important. And a big component of that is educating yourself and others on the possibilities for where we might end up. And so I think that that's another key thing that I'm going to, at least from this conversation now, take with me for the next week, is think about how I can enhance that almost transformative capacity, or that dimension of resilience in myself and kind of the others that I interact with.
You're reminding me of that old dictum, chance favors the prepared mind. It was the microbiologist, not Pasteur. Was it Pasteur? Chance favors the prepared mind, but this is kind of like change favors the prepared mind. In other words, you have to have that openness to change and to, hold on. You have to have the openness to the signals. In journalism, I talk about narrative capture. Don't be too captured by the narrative that you're already in. And it's a very hard property for us all, whether you're in science or journalism or public life, or to be open to change and to examine your predispositions. This has been a great chapter in our ongoing exploration here. This is an iterative process itself. Every day it's changed a little. I hope it's getting a little better and a little wider audience. This will be archived instantly when we're done, so people can share it with students and other colleagues. We can replicate. I'd love to see this model replicated, and talking with journalists about doing this kind of thing more. So let's keep it up. I'm going to close by actually reading something, but first, before I do that, I always try to honor the frontline folks around us who are directly imperiling themselves by being caretakers, caregivers, and responders. So here's a little, this is what this is about. Sustain What is a global conversation identifying solutions to the complicated, shape-shifting, and epic challenges of humanity's Anthropocene moment. A prime focus is making sense of and getting the most out of the planet's fast-forward information environment, the one Earth system changing faster than the actual environment. This is brought to you by Columbia University's Earth Institute Initiative on Communication and Sustainability, which itself is a brand new thing in the process of change. For the time being, these sessions will be focused on mitigating the unfolding societal disruption and devastation driven by the global spread of coronavirus disease 19, best known today as COVID-19. But we'll dip into other subjects and solutions when the time is right. So keep track. You can subscribe to this most easily on Periscope. The links are somewhere in whatever portal brought you to be with us today. And I do encourage you to share what we're doing. Comment on the Facebook or YouTube strings. They persist after we're done. And I have a feeling this crew will be back with us to do some re-examination of things. Next week, one of the exciting developments is that Herman Daly is going to be a guest with Kate Raworth. Kate Raworth is an economist now developing economic systems that are not fully extractive. And Herman Daly, for 50 years, has been at the pioneer in ecological economics. Tuesday, midday Eastern time. I'll work out the details between now and then. More sessions to come. Thank you all for being guests here, and spread the gospel of connectivity. And take care. Be well.
Thank you so much. Be well, everybody.
Thanks, Andy.
Bye.
Thank you.